Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. The Civil War was both a total war and the first modern war that we would fight. It was a war that began with the question of states' rights, but ended with the question of human rights. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 5 objectives today. That's an awful lot, but we can do it. By the end of this period, you should be able to, number 7, explain why the North and the South chose the path of military conflict in 1861. You should be able to assess why the stated war aims and military strategies of each side changed as the war progressed. You should be able to discuss why the Civil War is considered the first modern war. You should be able to evaluate the impact of the war on the northern states and evaluate it on the southern states. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 6. Here we begin with the discussion of the secession plot. Rather than accept a permanent minority status in a nation governed by their opponents, the Deep South political leaders decided to boldly strike out and go seek their own independence. In the months that followed Lincoln's election, 7 states stretching from South Carolina to Texas all seceded from the Union. These states were the heart of the Cotton Kingdom and were the highest percentage of slaves. The Upper South wouldn't secede, at least right away. They would eventually, but not in the beginning. It was really talking about the Deep South to get there. Subpoint B. The Lower South seceded on December 20th of 1860 when South Carolina led it. Basically, a South Carolina convention voted unanimously to secede from the Union. It was those fire eaters, those political firebrands that broke first. Elsewhere in the Deep South, they quickly followed. The secessionists met together in Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861 to proclaim a new nation. They called themselves the Confederate States of America. Now, the idea of a confederacy, we've been over in this class before. It's a type of organization that emphasizes its individual parts rather than its whole. And I think that you see that as the South is seceding, believing that the whole was too powerful, it's no surprise to me that they ended up as a confederacy. They adopted a new constitution and named Jefferson Davis as its new president. A provisional president, but definitely the president. Secessionist fervor was less intense in the Upper South, places like Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. There was fewer slaves up there and a different kind of slave culture. Their leaders urged compromise. In December of 1860, the President of the United States, so that's like the North, right? We're going to call it the United States. The Confederacy, I think you could argue was still the United States, but while they're seceding, we're going to treat them sort of a different one. But in 1860, President James Buchanan declared secession to be illegal. However, he said the federal government had no authority to restore the Union by force. So secession's against the law, they just can't seem to do anything about it. South Carolina demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter was a federal garrison out in Charleston Harbor. President Buchanan refused to order the Navy to go resupply the fort. So it's the United States fort out there for defensive purposes, but it's in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. And so basically South Carolina, then the Confederacy says, you need to give us that port to go there. And Buchanan says, no, but we're also not going to send our Navy up there and go get attacked to go do so. Subpoint C. Congress responded with a compromise known as the Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Plan called for a constitutional amendment that would permanently protect slavery from federal interference in any state where it already existed. Crittenden's second provision for the called for the westward extension of the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Slavery would be barred anywhere north of the line and protected anywhere south of the line, including any territories hereafter acquired. So like as the country would go and fill in those territories in the middle, like all of that part would follow the Missouri Proclamation line. Lincoln upheld the first part of the Crittenden Plan to go promise to protect slavery where it already existed, but he wasn't willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the California border because that would lead to its further expansion. Lincoln declared that secession was also illegal. So he, like Buchanan, said this is an illegal act. But he says that acts against the Union constituted essentially insurrection. And there he would go enforce federal laws, as well as to continue to protect federal property in those seceded states. So just because South Carolina goes and says, we're going to split off and have our own country, if there's federal property in there, Lincoln says he's going to go defend that territory. That Crittenden Compromise had support in the North, but the South obviously rejected it. The Confederate States of America ended up being, officially formed before Lincoln's inauguration by the 7 states that had seceded. They named Jefferson Davis as permanent president, not just a provisional president. Its constitution was almost exactly like the United States Constitution, except that it explicitly guaranteed slavery and heavily favored states' rights. Lincoln rejected secession, but he denied he ever intended to do anything about slavery at all. He issued the veiled warning, though. He says, "Into your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not into mine is the momentous issue of civil war." So basically, Lincoln is saying, like, hey, I'm not actually here to ban slavery. I don't want it to increase, but I'm not here to ban it. Whether or not we go to war isn't up to me. It's up to the people who are going to force my hand to go do so. Subpoint D. Lincoln made sure that the North didn't fire the first shot. But he did try to bait the Confederacy into doing so by baiting the Confederacy at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The fort on that island in Charleston Harbor was running low on supplies when they seceded. And Lincoln, unlike Buchanan, said that he was going to go tell the governor that he was going to go resupply it. The Confederates began the Civil War then by firing on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Jefferson Davis forced its surrender on April 14th, 2 days later, and Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to go swoop in and go suppress that insurrection. Although some Northerners were wary of the Lincoln administration, they remained supportive of the Union cause and responded positively to Lincoln's call to mobilize the militias. The states of the middle and border South they basically, if you were in between, the true North and the true South, you're kind of in that middle ground right there, you're forced to choose sides. And support for those states became crucial to the Confederacy because of the high populations and access to industry and fuel. So the more northern you get, the more like the economies are diversified, and the more access they get, and the better population and tax revenues that come out of it. 4 states in the upper South, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia, they also seceded and joined the Confederacy rather than aid in the United States. Lincoln reacted quickly to this and ordered General George McClellan to go secure railroad lines between Washington and the Ohio River in western Virginia. Farmers opposed secession, but now had the opportunity to vote for the new breakaway territory. The question is, West Virginia, this state that had been part of the state of Virginia, if Virginia is going to secede, but the people in this corner of the state don't want to secede, that split off and formed the new state of West Virginia, and it joined the Union in 1863. Delaware voted to stay in the Union, and Unionists secured the control of Maryland as well. The Union, when I say Union, I mean the United States, that's the North. The Union could retain control over Missouri, in part owing to support by German Americans. After a Confederate loss in September of 1861, Kentucky also stayed in the Union. So Kentucky, slave state, Missouri, slave state, but they voted to stay in the Union. Missouri actually tried to secede at one point, but didn't pull it off. Subpoint E. Lincoln portrayed the secession as an attack on popular government. He insisted the aggressive military strategy to go force a policy of unconditional surrender. Unconditional surrender is an important piece on this. It basically says that the South, the Confederacy, is going to surrender under, with no terms. That when they surrender in the Civil War, they're not saying yeah, we're going to surrender only under these conditions. No, unconditional surrender means that they're going to absolutely surrender. It's an aggressive strategy, and it basically guarantees that if you're going to carry out a policy of unconditional surrender, you're going to be in war for the long haul. The Union had many advantages. So in the North, there was the advantages, the manufacturing segments, the railroad mileage, they had financial resources. But to win, though, it's not enough to just be rich in the war. You also have to go win in the war. And they needed to conquer an area of the South. It was actually larger than Western Europe. If you imagine trying to conquer all of Europe, that's what the North had to go do to the South. Lincoln's early generals also weren't very good. They didn't successfully use the North's advantages in manpower and technology. Lincoln actually had a hard time finding any good generals to go lead the Northern charge. All the best military schools were in the South, and that's where their allegiances laid. Lincoln realized that his armies had to go defeat the Confederacy armies and to dismantle slavery. It was a tall task for anyone, especially if you had weak military leadership, which kind of constantly plagued Lincoln. Jefferson Davis, in the subpoint F of the Confederate approach, Jefferson Davis focused on the defense of the Confederacy rather than conquering territories. Jefferson Davis knows that what he really needs to do is win a war of attrition. He doesn't have to go make any incursions into the North. They might do it for strategic purposes, but the South doesn't have to go conquer the North. They just have to outlast the will of the North to go protect the South. And that's kind of their approach. It's a defensive tactic. They don't have to win as much as they don't just have to not lose. It didn't need to immediately invade the North. It just defend its own territory. The Confederacy only needed a military stalemate to guarantee independence. They just have to outlast the will of the Northerners. And Confederate soldiers were highly motivated fighters. And while the North has more money, the South definitely has more spirit and has, I think, a real tactical advantage. Subpoint G. On both sides, the outbreak of the war stirred these popular feelings of patriotism. The outbreak of the war found both sides, though, unprepared. They had underdeveloped railroads and small and inefficient navies and undersized army supply lines, and basically both sides go into war not well equipped to go into a war. Feeding and supplying the armies would be a challenge to both sides. Eventually the North and its industrial capacity would go catch up, and they would eventually be the best fed and best equipped military in history. Ever to that point, the North would eventually get there, but the South was truly fighting on the brink of starvation for most of the war. Despite the North's advantages, they just had a hard time translating that into real battlefield successes. Roman numeral number 7. Here, we're going to mark this point on the timeline of 1862. It's quite a year. And the war begins in the east with most of the war fighting on the narrow 100-mile corridor between Washington and Richmond. So Washington is like, in Virginia, and Richmond is then the capital of the South. So there's about a 100-mile corridor between the two of them, and that's where most of it was. And most of it was fought by in the North troops known as the Army of the Potomac. So like the Northern armies would be like, there would be the Massachusetts Army and the New Hampshire Army, but the Army of the Potomac was kind of like the major fighting force, and it was the piece that was set up in this corridor. Just a few miles west of Washington, D.C. was the First Battle of Bull Run. Southerners refer to it as the Battle of Manassas Creek. It was a Confederate victory, and it shattered any illusions that war was going to be romantic. Sometimes war gets romanticized as like, this is just a noble and clashing thing to do, and a soar of patriotism might push people to there. Well, Manassas Creek, the Battle of Bull Run, really disavowed people of that romanticism. And in July of 1861, General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate troops, they routed Irwin McDonald's troops near Manassas Creek. After the defeat, and it was quite a large defeat, Lincoln replaced McDowell with George McClellan and insisted on an additional 1 million men. The Army of the Potomac would have been absolutely a huge force. And there they would serve for 3 years in this newly created Army of the Potomac. And George McClellan essentially became the de facto commander of all the Union forces. I mean, there really was no like 5-star general in this, but if you're the head of the Army of the Potomac, then basically you're the main general directing all of the fighting. Subpoint B. Wooden ships with metal plates attached to their sides become known as ironclads. And this revolutionizes the way that naval warfare is going to carry on. So these ironclad ships were originally just wooden ships, and they just bolt pieces of iron onto the side. It makes them slower in the water, absolutely, but it also makes them essentially bulletproof. They were superior to wooden ships, and it revolutionized naval warfare. The most famous battle was between the first two on either side, known as the Monitor and the Merrimack, and they squared off against each other in March of 1862. The Confederates had the Merrimack. It was an old burned-out U.S. warship, and they took it and they outfitted it with the rail, like the iron rails from a railroad, and they put it on the sides and armored it up, and it was also a battering ram. It could go smash through ships was the idea, and it's the Merrimack. It belonged to the Confederate side. The Union Army outfitted the Monitor, and it was also an ironclad ship, a wooden ship that they'd put the iron armor on the side of it. And in their first fight in March of 1862, both sides would launch cannonballs at each other, and they would bang off the side. It probably made a terrible clatter, but they were unable to go sink each other. The Monitor prevented the South from using their new weapon, and the Merrimack couldn't go and take down the Monitor as well. And it basically ended the era of wooden ships. They were at the Civil War of March of 1862. Subpoint C. In 1862, McClellan launched a thrust towards Richmond, Virginia. That was the capital of the Confederacy, but he moved awful slowly. This is sort of a classic McClellan problem. He's got a big army, but it does a hard time using it. It moved too slowly, and it allowed the Confederates actually to go mount a counterattack in the meantime. General Robert E. Lee launched that counterattack outside of Richmond, suffering heavy casualties. But McClellan didn't exploit that advantage. So in the counterattack, the South lost a whole, Robert E. Lee's South goes and loses a whole bunch of men, and McClellan should go swoop in when they're down and go get there, but they didn't. McClellan failed to exploit that advantage, and Richmond remained secure. General Lee blunted McClellan's attacks in Virginia, and it forced him to withdraw back to the vicinity of Washington. Successful on the defensive, then Lee launched an invasion of the North. In spring of 1862, a Confederate Army under the direction of Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson marched up the north, up the Shenandoah Valley in western Virginia to go threaten Washington, D.C. So it's spring now of 1862. The Confederates are going to go march on the U.S. Capitol to get there, and they're going up the Shenandoah Valley to go up to Washington, D.C., led by Stonewall Jackson. Employing just the audacity of the moment and also a rapid, unpredictable movements on the interior lines, Stonewall's 17,000 men marched 646 miles in 48 days. That is a breakneck speed when you're walking it. They won several minor battles, as they successfully engaged 3 Union armies, prevented them from reinforcing the Union outside against Richmond. In June of 1862, General Robert E. Lee launched the attack against Richmond, suffering heavy casualties, but McClellan failed to... that sentence just appears in there twice. That's weird. Subpoint D. Now let's turn our eyes westward to the Mississippi Valley. And here I want you to meet Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was the architect of any early success in the West. The Union was dominating the Ohio River Valley. In February of 1862, Grant won the first Union significant victory when he captured Fort McHenry and Fort Donaldson in Tennessee. In April of that year, the Confederate Army caught Grant by surprise, though, in Shiloh in Tennessee, and Grant forced a Confederate withdrawal, but it was an expensive withdrawal and caused a great number of casualties. So, okay, just in a couple of sentences there. Ulysses S. Grant in the Ohio River Valley goes and takes 2 forts from the Confederacy in Tennessee. And then in April, they turns around and the Confederacy goes and, sneaks up on Grant to go get him. Grant can defend himself, but it was an expensive cost to go do so. Union naval forces, commanded by David Farragut, captured the port city of New Orleans, which was the financial capital of the South, and it was the largest city in the South. And when the Union forces go take that, basically that gives them a strong naval, foothold into and a base for future naval operations. Union victories in the West significantly hurt Confederate strengths in the Mississippi River Valley. So while McClellan is mostly flailing on defending his line, in the West, Grant is doing a better job of holding down the Western Front. Subpoint E. Jackson and Lee routed a Union army in the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, the Second Battle of Manassas Creek. McClellan's Army of the Potomac stopped Lee at the Battle of Antietam in Maryland, and in the single bloodiest day in U.S. history, September 17th of 1862. That single bloodiest day, this is a pretty bloody day. It's 7,650 casualties. It remains the deadliest day for Americans in war history. The Battle of Antietam Creek on September 17th of 1860. Man, that is really phrased badly. Jackson's troops arrived just in time to go save Lee's troops from defeat. Lincoln replaced General McClellan. Basically, McClellan was flailing out there on the Potomac. It wasn't getting anywhere. And so he fired him and replaced him with a guy named Ambrose Burnside. Ambrose Burnside led a disastrous assault on Lee at Fredericksburg in Virginia. So now that Burnside's got the keys to the Army of the Potomac, he goes and charges on to Robert E. Lee and walks right into a bloodbath, resulting in a disastrous Union defeat. He resigned then and was replaced by a different general, a guy named Joe Hooker, known as Fightin' Joe. Subpoint Roman numeral number 8. Here I want to kind of change the storyline a little bit. Rather than just talk about the blood of the battlefield, to talk about how the war was carried out. And it was carried out by a method known as a total war. And the idea of a total war, every single person is considered a belligerent. There are really no civilians in a civil war or in a total war, and that everything around you is fair game for it. Railroads were vital to the war effort, particularly in the North, where the greater railroad infrastructure existed. Now, there was still limited, these are the early days of the railroad, but most of it is in the North, and that gives them a strategic advantage in moving materials around. But there was no standard gauge. It's not like there was this is the size of a railroad track. They would vary, and you can't just put cars on one and the other. It would just fall off the tracks, right? And the trains built for one track, they wouldn't fit on another. The introduction of a rifle changed the nature of combat. And this is actually one of the big deals with the Civil War. The Civil War was fought with kind of old traditional style of fighting. Like in the Revolutionary War, everybody gets in a straight line, wears the same coat, and goes and shoots their opponent. And then they volley, reload their guns, and then, get shot at by the other side. And the old muskets used in the Revolutionary War, or the War of 1812, or any kind of a battle up to this point, muskets weren't very accurate. And actually the only way that they were successful in warfare is everybody just lines up side by side and sends over a volley of bullets at once. But rifles changed all of that. The inside of a rifle barrel has little grooves cut into it, and it makes the bullet, when it comes out of it, to spin in a spiral, like throwing a spiral at a football. It flies much straighter and much farther than just the old musket ball, which would be just banging around in a solid core tube on it. And that changed the nature of combat. It created farther shooting weapons and far more accurate weapons, but combined with the old outdated battle tactics. In this case, they were still lining up in a straight line and shooting a volley of shots over the other, but far more accurate weapons meant that the Civil War was very, very good at getting Americans killed, and it resulted around 750,000 soldiers' death. Modern warfare also included things like prisoner of war camps and the disease that comes associated with it. So in a lot of ways, the Civil War is kind of a war of the old world of fighting tactics, but also a war of the new world and the new technology. It makes it far, far more brutal. Subpoint B. Both sides were assisted by a propaganda campaign to go mobilize public opinion, and it was a vast campaign. New technology like lithographs and souvenirs and sheet musics and patriotic organizations. I mean, this is a war that's being photographed. telegraphed in real time. The war was brought to the people by newspapers along the way. And the Civil War was really a turning point in this. It's a turning point for photography as an art and as a business. And here I want to introduce one of the greatest photographers of any age, but definitely of this age, a guy named Matthew Brady. Matthew Brady was America's first great photojournalist, and he would go organize teams of photographers to go record battle scenes and do it in real time with like actual journalists taking pictures of the war going on. Sadly, a lot of these photographs, while many exist, so many more of them were destroyed because basically after the Civil War, this is feeling like we don't want to remember how bad it was, but startling firsthand accounts. Subpoint D. With the withdrawal of troops from the West, increased conflict between Indians and white settlers, notably the Sioux attacks in Minnesota. They had killed hundreds of white settlers until being subdued by the Army. And Colonel Chivington's massacre of the Cheyenne and Arapaho at Sand Creek, Colorado, there 400 Indians got killed. So basically, like, the troops were holding down the peace there and then withdrew to go fight in the war effort. But to do so, like, disrupted the balance of power. A Union campaign against the Navajo people led to what's known as the Long Walk. It was a removal basically the Navajo were removed from their lands and go shipped off to a reservation elsewhere. Eventually they did return, but not before the damage was done. Confederates treated Indians better than the United States did. Their constitution allowed Indian tribes to elect, even members of Congress. Slave-owning tribes, such as the Cherokee, sided with the Confederacy. And while we don't often think of the Confederacy as one of those places that's really good for civil rights, they did treat Indians better than the United States was treating it. Roman numeral number 9. Here I want to talk about how the North transitioned in this era to go turn itself into a modern economy supporting a modern war. Republicans saw any criticism of the war effort or any criticism of Lincoln's policies as basically equivalent to treason. During a time of war, it's not unusual to think if you're not with us, you're against us, and Republicans treated any criticism of the war just like that. They called their war opponents copperheads. And the reason they called them copperheads because it was one of the ways that a person would protest the wars. They would take a copper penny and put a stud on it and affix it to their jacket lapel and wear it like a lapel pin. Because it said liberty on the front of the penny. And so basically that was an opponent to the war would go wear that liberty penny and they would become known as copperheads. Copperheads, of course, are a dangerous snake, and that's the way the Republicans saw any criticism of the war. People making those claims would be dangerous snakes. To prevent sabotage and any concerted resistance against the war effort in the Union, Lincoln also took a move that I think he gets a lot of criticism for today. He suspended the habeas corpus protections. Habeas corpus protections are part of the rights of the accused, means that person can't just be thrown in jail for no reason. They have to have some legal reason to get there. But Lincoln said during a time of war, the rules are different, and if a person's causing trouble, we'll get them in jail and figure out the charges later. People criticize him for that, and I think there's a case to be made for a real criticism, even among America's, one of his greatest presidents. He also extended martial law to civilians who discouraged enlistment or resisted the draft. If a person was drafted into the Army but resisted to go do so, Lincoln employed martial law to go enforce that. After the war, the Supreme Court made it clear in a case known as Ex parte Milligan that the Constitution was not suspended in the wartime, and things like habeas corpus protections don't just disappear. But that wasn't really settled until after the war was over. Lincoln wasn't a despot, and I think this is important to remember. Sometimes Lincoln gets accused of being essentially a dictator at a time of trouble, and I don't think that's a fair criticism of Lincoln, but the Civil War also showed that the civil liberties were curbed with demands for patriotism and national unity, and sometimes even our greatest protections seem to fall aside when the poop hits the fan. Subpoint D. The military carnage of 1862 forced both sides into that total war we talked about earlier, utilizing all of the resources of both nations to go win at all costs. The Union government's Militia Act of 1862 set a quota of volunteers for each state, and it was increased by the Enrollment Act of 1863. The Union also allowed men to avoid military service if they could go provide a substitute or pay a $300 fee to go do so. Hostility to the Enrollment Act of 1863 to the draft and to African Americans spilled into the streets of New York City, where Irish and German workers sacked the homes of Republicans. They killed a dozen African Americans and forced hundreds of black families from their homes. Lincoln rushed in with Union troops to go suppress the insurrection, but in what's known as the New York City draft riots, basically people thought that this was an unfair war. Subpoint C. Women stepped into the workforce as nurses, factory workers, and government clerks. This is not an unusual pattern in war where the men are off fighting the war and the women swoop in to go do the jobs the men were doing. Hundreds of thousands of Northern women took part in humanitarian organizations as well, most notably by taking on a role in what was known as the Sanitary Commission and other wartime agencies. And here I want to introduce you to two important women of the era. The first one is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was the first woman to receive a major federal appointment when she served as superintendent of Army nurses, she was overseeing lots of people to go do so, and Dorothea Dix, first one to receive a major appointment to do so. The next person I want you to meet is Clara Barton. Clara Barton was the president of the American National Red Cross. She lobbied for the United States to endorse the first Geneva Convention in 1864. Clara Barton, some Kansans might know her as the only woman to have a county in Kansas named after her. So of all the counties in Kansas, however many are named after people, Barton County is named after Clara Barton. It's the only county that's named after a woman. She never visited there, but they really admired her work. Women staffed growing bureaucracies. They volunteered to serve as nurses and filled positions typically held by men. A number of women also took on military duties as spies and as scouts, and even some disguised as men operated as soldiers. Subpoint D. The Union entered the war with a real distinct advantage. Its economy was far superior to the South's, and its arms factories were equipped for mass production, and the South essentially didn't have factories. They were almost entirely a cotton kingdom, right? To sustain allegiance of Northerners to their party, while bolstering the Union's ability to go fight the war, Republicans raised tariffs and instituted the first income tax in American history. They sold war bonds and created a national banking system. They devised a system of internal improvements, especially railroads, and developed the Homestead Act of 1862, which I hope to talk more about in the future. But the Homestead Act basically said if a person would go settle into the West, they can get 160 acres of land. That does a couple of things. It also it evens out population. It makes the population richer. It puts Northerners in positions for future popular sovereignty claims. But all of those were really about improving the economic position of the North during the war. And the second was the Land Grant College Act to go help states establish agricultural and mechanical colleges. Congress's authorization also for a transcontinental railroad in 1862 encouraged the allegiance of farmers and workers and entrepreneurs, and it allowed the Union to fight a protracted war. So basically, all of these pieces go and get Americans on the side of the North to go support the Civil War, and they come in and say, yes, this is worth fighting for. Railroads connected industries, manufacturing guns and clothes and foods with the Union Army. Bankers and financiers were also benefiting from the government's modern system of public finance. Republicans financed that war by imposing broad-based taxes and issuing U.S. Treasury bonds and a national monetary system through the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which authorized the printing of paper money. These paper money becomes known as greenbacks, and it was organized through the federal government to go do so. Sometimes paper money is unstable. We saw it in the Revolutionary War that it's just an unstable type of currency, and that's also true during the Civil War, but it's whatever they can do to go keep the money supply moving. This new fiscal system did result in the concentration of wealth and capital in the hands of industrialists and financiers, and it did appear to threaten the small producer society and the future of democratic self-government. The rising class, though, of the capitalist entrepreneurs, they gained power, particularly in the North, which prospered during the war. Industry benefited from inflation and government contracts. Roman numeral number 10. Here I want to talk about the challenges the Confederacy faced. First issue is the question of leadership and government. Jefferson Davis, when he becomes president, realizes that it's a fearful thing, and I think pretty much immediately regretted being the president of the Confederacy. He was unable to communicate the war's meaning very effectively to ordinary men and women, and he became very unpopular in his job. I'm not terribly surprised he becomes unpopular in his job. I mean, the nature of a Confederacy is to downplay the role of a central government, which is exactly what Jefferson Davis is trying to do. And he also didn't deal very effectively with the obstructionist governors, which had a primacy in a Confederate type of government. Under Jefferson Davis, the Confederate nation became far more centralized than the Old South ever had been under the Union, though, as the Confederate government tried to control railroads and build factories to go support the war. Subpoint B. Although the armies of both sides could initially count on volunteers to go fill their ranks, both governments had to resort to conscription, and conscription means a draft. After the defeat of Shiloh in 1862, the Confederate Congress imposed America's first legally binding military draft, impressing men into service. The Confederate draft had two loopholes, though. It exempted one white man for each 20 slaves on a plantation, and it allowed drafted men to go hire substitutes. So if you had oversaw a large plantation, I shouldn't say you, because it's not about you. If a person oversaw a large plantation and had a lot of slaves to go do so, then they could go be exempted from the draft to go fight in the war. Or if they had enough money to go hire somebody in their stead to go fight in the war. This result was a lot of poor Southerners had to go fight the war, and the rich Southerners could go stay at home and not fight the war. A lot of yeoman farmers started seeing the conflict as a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. Some Southerners refused to serve altogether, and the Confederate government lacked the power to compel them. The Confederate Congress overrode the state judge's orders to go free conscripted men. Subpoint C. Now let's talk about women in the Confederacy, because they hold a distinctly different position than women in the North do, women in the South. More than in the North, the war placed unprecedented burdens on Southern white women. They were often left alone on the plantations to go manage the farm and go manage the slaves, and many were entirely unprepared for the task at hand to go do so. The war led to political mobilization among non-slaveholding white women as well, and the growing dissatisfaction of Southern white women contributed to the decline of home front morale and encouraged desertion from the army. Essentially, women were writing letters back to the home front and the men and talking about just how poorly they were managing the plantation and just how poorly they were managing the slaves and the staff and everything going back home. And the South was fighting on the brink of starvation in the army, but as well as there just wasn't, the economy was crashing. It was a hard time, and a lot of men fighting in the war said, I really needed back home, and deserted the army to get there. Subpoint D. The Confederates had substantial industrial capacity. While they did have some substantial industrial capacity, that's a bad phrase. The Confederates did not have substantial industrial capacity. It's exactly wrong. But by 1863, they were able to provide every infantryman with a modern rifle musket-style gun. Still, though, the economy was an absolute crisis. Numerous yeoman families went to war to go preserve their economic independence, and they sank into poverty and debt, and food riots were common. I mean, the South often went to go to war to go protect slavery because they said they're protecting their economy, and then while they're in war, their economy is collapsing around them. The Confederates tried to use their power as King Cotton to go pressure Europeans to go side with the South, cutting off supplies to Europe and starve them of any cloth. They basically said, okay, we want Europe to come in on our side of the war, and to go do so, we'll force their hand by cutting off cotton sales to them. But the effort failed because Europeans had actually stockpiled a whole bunch of cotton and could sort of ride out the American Civil War. Confederate leaders counted on cotton revenue to go provide revenues to purchase clothes and boots and blankets and weapons from abroad, but when they go and drop this embargo on Europe, they're suddenly not making any money off the trade. And the one thing the South does really well is export cotton, and suddenly they're not exporting cotton, they're trying to do it to force their hand, and that's not working, and the South ends up, I think, shooting themselves in the foot on this case. The Confederate leaders, they basically had very few trading partners in the North, and they didn't have any trading partners in Europe as well. The British government never recognized the independence of the Confederacy, but it did recognize a rebel government as a belligerent power with the right under international law to go borrow money and purchase weapons. So in Great Britain, they said the Confederacy, we don't think it's a legit government, but a rebellious power does have some banking rights, and if they need to go borrow money to go see how this plays out, that's a legal move. The Confederacy's economic policy changed from reliance on states individually to centralization. The Jefferson Davis administration built and operated shipyards and armories and foundries and textile mills. They commandeered food and raw materials. They requisitioned slaves to go work on fortifications and directly controlled foreign trade. The Confederate Congress and ordinary people, they opposed any of those Davis's provisions. Like Jefferson Davis he's trying to centralize the economy and centralize the country. People are like, but that's kind of what we're trying to avoid here. And they feared strong governments and high taxes. The government financed about 60% of the war expenses with unbacked paper money, so the South was also just printing paper money to go do so. That created inflation. The inflation resulted in riots and led to the violation of citizens' property rights in order to go sustain the war. The South's economy, unlike the North, was in total wartime crisis, and by the end of the war, there was 100,000 Southern men just absolutely deserting. The North and the South, their economic policies go in different directions because their economies are set up differently, as well as sort of the economic cultures of both sides just gave the North a real advantage over the South. That advantage of the North over the South, while it does have a hard time showing up at the battlefield, does show up in the economy, and in the long run will succeed. In the long run is a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.